welcome. I think we've got everybody in here now. My name's Canberra Houston. I'm a member of the Conservation Commission, and what we're going to be seeing tonight, and welcome to Sean, is his presentation on salt marshes and salt marsh haymaking and the history of it in the Northeast. But first of all, I'd like to thank Danielle, for providing. She co-sponsored this with the Conservation Commission for providing the equipment and the expertise, which we really needed. So we thank you very much for that. And I'd like to also introduce the other members of the Conservation Commission. So we've got Scott Williams over here and Kevin McGee here. We've got Joe Nugent over here and Doug Clark. Patricia DiLeonardo is the one running the recording the session tonight. So if you want to watch it again, it'll be available, I believe, later on GCTV. Yeah, great. I just wanted to say very briefly, the Conservation Commission, very briefly, is charged with the development, conservation, supervision, and regulation of the natural resources within the territorial limits of Guilford. The Commission has direct management on 1,580 acres of open space town property containing over 26 miles of trail. And among our charges are education and outreach like this tonight, the program tonight. But I also want to tell you a little bit about an upcoming program we've got in April 25th from 11 to 2 on the Guilford Green. Is going to be an Earth Day event. I think this is the third year for Earth Day event. It will be done in conjunction with Parks and Rec and also Sustainable Guilford Task Force and the Conservation Commission. And during that event, from 11 to 2 on the green, there's lots of nonprofit organizations that have educational materials for people about what we can do to help keep our earth green. And there will be fun activities for kids, lots of different things. So I hope you come to learn and have fun. It's April 25th on the green, 11 to 2. So now I am very pleased to introduce to you Sean Roach. He's the Visitor Services Manager at the Stuart B. McKinney National Wildlife Refuge, where he focuses on education and outreach. He grew up in Waterbury, Connecticut, and attended Central Connecticut State University, where he earned his bachelor's and master's degree in public history. He worked for the National Park Service at Sagamore Hill, National Historic Site, home of Teddy Roosevelt, in Oyster Bay, New York, and then transferred to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, returning to Connecticut. Sean lives with his wife and their young son and daughter, Joe Cromwell, which is where he came from to talk to us tonight. And if we have time, he's also going to cover the status of the Great Meadow Salt Marsh Restoration Project that is going on in the Stratford Lordship area along the shoreline, just to give us an idea of what's happening with salt marshes today. So without further ado, Sean, thank you.
So thank you very much, Kendra, and the other members of the commission, the library, and everybody who's attending tonight, including some very good refuge volunteers and other friends that I'm happy to see. So welcome. This presentation is going to be about both salt marshes and the history of people using them for salt marsh hay. And I just want to start off, because a lot of people are not too familiar with it, with a little bit about where I work. So these are some photographs of wildlife on the refuge where I work. The far photo are some osprey taken at Calf Island in Greenwich. Middle photo is a great egret. Sorry, I'm blanking on that. I'm not talking about wading birds tonight. Great egret in the Norwalk Islands, and these are common terns at a place called Faulkner Island, which everybody in this town has heard of, and their baby. There are about 6,000 terns that live on Faulkner Island every summer, so it's a pretty cool place. Trying to advance this slide here, and it's not working. Hang on a second. All right. The refuge actually encompasses units from Westbrook, which is our headquarters at Salt Meadow. A very nice place to actually take a walk. Almost any day of the year. We're open 365 days a year. That's about 400 acres, and that's where I report to every day. And then we have various units all the way down the coast to Greenwich. So the refuge is relatively small in acreage, but these are pieces of basically ancient Connecticut that are saved along the coast when most of the coast, as you know, has been developed into marinas and industry and houses and things like that. So there's very few habitats that are left intact. And the ones that are part of the refuge, part of the state park system and things like that. The things that we do at the refuge are, number one, conserving wildlife, especially at-risk species. So it could be state endangered, federally endangered plants and animals, and also talking to people about them. So that's what that's our mission here in Connecticut, to do a lot of education with young people, with older folks, everybody, on what we do at the refuge and how we do it. The refuge actually started, even though it's called Stuart B. McKinney, because of a woman named Esther Lape. There's a photograph of her at the age of 90. In that photo, she's wearing a white outfit. She often wore white, especially in the summer, but she wore white because she was a 1920s suffragette. And tons of photos from the 20s all the way till the 70s that we have of her. She's wearing white. She's talking to a gentleman named Nathaniel Reed, who was President Nixon's Assistant Secretary of the Interior. He wrote the Endangered Species Act with a few other people. And he was very responsible for that big push of environmental protection in the 1970s from the federal government. He was very happy when Esther Lape contacted the government to donate her land in Westbrook, and that's how the refuge got started. And you can see the marsh as it existed in 1936 from one of the aerial photos. This is the way it looks today. Beautiful place. If you're kind of buried in the back there on a kayak, you feel like you're in the wilderness. There's no one around. It's a cool place to go, especially in the late summer, early fall. It's my favorite time of the year. So, salt marshes. The government was very grateful to get this big salt marsh. She owned a lot of this land and convinced a lot of her neighbors to donate pieces of the marsh in 1972 when it became the first refuge in Connecticut. And salt marshes are very special habitat. They only exist in, a certain chunk of the eastern United States and other places, but we're going to be talking about the Northeast today and how important these habitats are today and how they were important to farmers as soon as they came from Europe. They're unique places because they're basically breeding grounds for lots of animals, turtles, crabs, fish, some birds. And they're also helpful in that they absorb things like storm surges or even chemical spills for us, to protect us as well. Sort of some of the species that you might find in the marsh, these are all photos that either I took or our biologist took. So snowy egrets right here. In the middle there, the top center, is a plant called marsh pink. It's a plant that is endangered in Connecticut. The only place that it exists today is a refuge. in Great Meadows, which I'll be talking about a little bit later. So it's been extirpated. It doesn't exist anywhere else in the state, and it's rare pretty much everywhere. But it's doing pretty well in our marsh in Stratford. Great blue heron, glossy ibis, terrapin, and a kingfisher. So all of these things, plus many, many more things, can be seen in our marshes. This is kind of the layout of how a marsh works and the different parts of it. So you've got things like, I'm just going to move away from the mic for a second here. You've got things like crabs, blue crabs, horseshoe crabs, utilizing this area, and a little bit of the lower marsh area, but mostly the open waters. Fish that lay their eggs there. You've got some salt pans and pools. These can be important for animals to find food. Milkfish that are swimming around in there become food for our long-legged wading birds and other birds. Kingfishers. Breeding area for good insects like dragonflies. One of the things that we tried to prevent with the Great Meadows restoration was mosquito breeding. So I'll talk a little bit about that later. And then the upper part of the marsh, the border, that's where things like marsh pink grow. That's where you might find little mammals hanging around. We often see things like muskrat in our marshes, especially down in Stratford. Now, this is the lower part of the marsh, and it's dominated by something called Spartina alterniflora. So if you're there at low tide, you're kind of walking around. I wouldn't recommend walking directly into this area, but you can see this low marsh area, and that's where these muddy channels, these little creeks are with this tall grass. So the tall grass actually grows in the low part of the marsh. And in the higher part of the marsh, the upper part, we get the lower grasses, the shorter grasses, I should say. So this is called Spartina patens, or salt hay. And this is what our farmers are looking out for. They're not interested in almost anything else in the marsh except for this plant and some of the things that get intertwined with it, like lavender, marsh lavender, and things like that. Sometimes it looks kind of like your lawn. Sometimes it's in cowlicks, so these sort of wavy areas. This is usually about 6 inches, 12 inches, maybe up to 2 feet. And that's kind of when the farmers would harvest it toward the end of the season. So that's what they're looking for. So when did salt haying start? We're pretty sure that Native Americans did not use the marshes for salt haying, and it started when Europeans came here. So Native Americans certainly used the marshes for lots of different things, mostly to find food, finfish, shellfish, birds, anything that was living in the marsh. They used some plants, probably mostly for medicinal purposes, but of course they didn't keep livestock, and that's the main purpose of going out and finding salt hay. So salt haying really starts when Europeans show up here in the 1600s. They were here a little bit before, but it starts in earnest in the 1600s. These, by the way, are just illustrations of sort of the period. The lower graphic there is basically a 16th century work of art that was done of Native Americans using the marshes of Virginia and Chesapeake Bay. And then the upper part there is a guy named Roger Ludlow who founded Norwalk, Connecticut, what we think he looked like, or at least they did in the 1930s, negotiating with Native Americans in that area to exchange land for things. That's a WPA. work of art from the 1930s. I think it's in the Norwalk Post Office, which is typical of WPA projects of that era. Almost immediately, when the colonies are set up and lots of Europeans are settling here along the coast, that's where they started their settlements, of course, there are conflicts. So this quote at the bottom from historic Ipswich is basically putting a penalty out there if you fight with your neighbors over the salt marsh to get hay. So even in 1663, they were already putting like a 5 shilling fine on this because it was a recurring problem. So later on, people kind of had their plots, and I don't think that this had to be enforced, but in the early days it was. So this is actually a little video that I'm going to play. And this is one of Connecticut's last salt hay farmers. He thought that he was the last. I have no reason to doubt that. He was from the Stonington area, so let's listen to him describe.
During the Revolutionary War, Connecticut farmers supplied the emerging nation's army with most of its food, earning the state its nickname, the Provision State. One important commodity was salt hay grown in the marshes along coastal Connecticut.
All you had to do was cut it every year. You didn't have to plow or harrow, seed, no fertilize. It was here. It was used by all the farmers or anyone that had a cow or two. You just could not survive without it. And it's called the Continental Marshes because during the Revolutionary War, the farmers were all provision farms around here. And we used to come down, my ancestors did, and mold this marsh by hand with a scythe, rig it up by hand, and it was hauled up to the farm and stacked. And when Washington supply trains came through from New York to Boston and going the other way, they had a campground out here in Center Groton. And the scouts would go ahead and notify the farms that they needed fodder, corn and hay for 100 oxen.
Whit Davis is the owner of the farm established in the mid-1600s by Thomas Stanton, the Interpreter General for the New England colonies.
I'm 81 years old, and I worked here on the farm ever since I was able to walk 7 days a week. I'm the last commercial salt hay harvester in Connecticut. We used to grow dairy and beef cattle here, and we had work teams of horses and sheep. But we've gone out of the livestock business because if it doesn't pay, it doesn't stay.
So I like that little clip. He was one of the last connections to this business, basically, of raising salt hay. He talks about the continental marshes and how the armies, basically, during the Revolution, passing this way, put in their orders from these farmers to feed their oxen, to feed their horses. And that's what this stuff was for, cows and things like that as well. And even up until, I think that video was taken about 15 years ago. So up till the early 21st century, this was done in Connecticut commercially. So why did they want salt hay? It's cattle feed. You could use it for animal bedding. You could also use it for insulation in homes or other places that you wanted to keep warm. You might want to keep your livestock warm, and you would just stuff it into crevices and things like that. Sometimes farmers often did other you would say today, side hustles, right? So they would be potters, and they would want to pack their pottery and ship it somewhere, and they would use salt hay for that when there was no such thing as packing peanuts. So farmers using it for lots of different purposes. And as Whit Davis said, you didn't have to plant it. You didn't have to fertilize it. It just grew. And it was very easy from that perspective. It wasn't always easy to harvest, but it was very easy because you didn't have to do anything. It just grew there. So challenges in marsh hay. So obviously marshes are not solid ground. Has anybody here ever walked into a marsh? I do it quite a few times a year. So you have to know what tide it is. You have to know that basically you can only walk in the high marsh where there's green stuff. You don't want to walk on anything that looks too wet. You don't want to walk on brown stuff. So they had to know all of this. And this is what the marsh looks like. We, at the refuge, take samples of the basically core samples of different areas of the marsh. And it's almost like a sponge made out of decaying material. It's not really solid ground at all. So you'd have to plan for that. Now, farmers didn't always just leave marshes the way they were. One thing that we're discovering more and more, and we have in the last 20 years or so, is that they did a lot of manipulation. So we think of engineering as a very modern thing, but engineering has been around since, the Great Wall of China and the Romans building roads and viaducts and things. And in the 1600s, when these people came here from England and Holland, they were actually familiar with dikes and engineering and controlling water and pushing it the way you wanted it to go, and keeping it out of certain areas. So obviously this is a very elaborate system here from Europe, and the farmers didn't build anything close to this, but it was something that they were familiar with. And their ancestors in England or other parts of Europe probably did a little bit of it when they were there. So they did build dikes in certain areas of the marsh to keep that marsh hay at the right elevation, not too flooded, and they tried to manipulate things when they could. There's still evidence in the marshes of manipulation. So if you look at this, this aerial, this satellite image, you can actually see a dike that's been broken up now, of course, in the 21st century. But this was meant to keep water from the sound on the south here from inundating this area. This dike may not have been built for the purpose that we're talking about. It is very large. But other dikes, similar dikes, built on a smaller scale by farmers quite a bit. They also dug channels to drain certain areas too. This is the marsh in Stratford at the beginning of the 20th century. We don't have a good date on this photograph, but we know that probably the 1910s, 1920s, because of the telephone poles. Kind of a strange sight to have a dirt road through a marsh with telephone poles. But apparently that was the straightaway so they could get wiring across the marsh. So they put those there. And these are the very large piles of salt hay, which are distinct from most other fields that you might see that are not in marshes. So this structure is actually called a staddle. There's evidence of sort of elevating your grasses and your grain from hundreds of years ago. This image on the top left is from Europe, but there's a very similar structure actually at Old Sturbridge Village with these stones that are elevating this grain storage building above the ground, keeping it dry, maybe keeping a little, maybe not perfect, but keeping pests out of it, at least to some extent, right? And then the staddle on the bottom there is what they would do in the marshes. So these staddles, ancient way to elevate grains and grasses. The logs that you see there are put up in a circular pattern. They're made from cedar, typically, or ash or some other wood that would not rot very easily. There are actually some cedar posts in our marshes today that are probably 100 years old, or maybe a little bit less than that have just been stuck there and they're not rotting. Sometimes when they laid this platform on the bottom, they would just use cordgrass, that long stuff that grows in the low marsh, as a platform to make it a little bit easier to stack things up, and that they weren't going to use that for animal fodder or anything. You couldn't do this yourself, you and your son or your daughter. Not easy to do. This was kind of done like an Amish barn raising. These people would all get together and they would all help each other. Unlike the 1600s when they fought all over the marshes and were fined. As time moved on, it was kind of a big family and neighborly affair. These are some great photos. These are my favorite photos in the whole presentation. These are from Hampton, New Hampshire, so the seacoast of New Hampshire. I don't know the year, but probably 100 to 120 years ago, of these guys stacking everything up together. Favorite thing about photo is this person, this gentleman here. You can see how worn out his trousers are and how filthy he is in doing this job. Just dust and dirt all over his back. And it's kind of a way of life that most Americans are not too familiar with. Even farmers these days have a tough job, but they have like $100,000 John Deere that they get into rather than doing this. So we're not used to this anymore, and I love to see it in the photos. There's also a video, which I'll show you next, of people actually doing this for a reenactment. So let's see that. Right there.
So all we did to start was just start laying hay on the top of those poles. That way, as you pick up a pile, what we did in the beginning was use the poles or a 4-beater one, but weren't large enough, well, almost a pancake, if you will, hay that will sit on top of those poles. You don't want a little bunch of hay that will wind up falling down between the poles. So that's how you have to get it started. Then after we were up a couple of feet, we got somebody up on the stack and started, as we say, laying the stack. Laying the stack is stacking the hay where you want it on the pile in order to keep it in good shape, and also in compressing it down. A lot of it is just simply walking around up there and treading everything down, packing it down as you go. We want it as tightly compressed as we can so that it will not absorb water, but the rainwater and snow will basically run off.
So what he's describing there, other than the way that they lay that stack, is they want it to be almost rain and snow proof. And the reason for that is these were often kept in the marsh for a long period of time. They stacked these and then they would come back to them later. That's why they're elevated, so they don't get flooded. So less problem with rodents. The cone shape sheds water and snow, at least a bit. So you'd come back to these throughout the winter sometimes. And it was often the kids. There's actually a couple of stories that I came across of the teenage sons of these farmers who would have to go out with a wagon and gather this stuff and bring it back into the barn. So it was really a community affair. They'd bring animals out into the marshes. They'd use, if the marsh was set up in a way where they could do this, they would use boats. I'll talk about that in just a second, what kind they were. Back then, the men did almost all this work, the men and the boys, and the women came along with them if they were going to be there all day or for overnight, and they would make the food. They'd bring a lot of food. They'd cook some food while they were there. They'd make things like switchel. If it was a hot day, they'd make clam chowder from seafood that they caught right in the marsh. So that's how it was done. And then you'd have to use specialty equipment for this. These bog shoes or swamp shoes still exist. They're basically, giving your horse or your ox or whatever it was that you brought out there a little bit more of a platform so their hooves didn't dig into this mud and get stuck, because that would be a bad day. If that happened, right? These photos are from Long Island. This harvesting took place from about the Chesapeake, but really from New Jersey up to New Hampshire, southern Maine. So that's the swath of land that we're talking about here that's really good for this. In Connecticut, Long Island, Massachusetts, where the guy who was talking about during the reenactment was from, that's the heart of salt marsh haying. There were also special boats called gundelows that were designed for this work. So you can see a gundelo there, the sort of the side profile of what they looked like. And then this one here is all stacked with hay. So if they weren't going to they didn't keep all of these, all this hay stacked up. They took some of it back with them, obviously, to use. So sometimes they would use these boats with very shallow drafts and a big sail. Sometimes they would push them with long poles through these marshes and the shallow channels there. So it was kind of a specialty item that some farmers had, or that if one person had it, they would use it for multiple families to get that hay back. And these are just some more photos from Long Island as well. And you can see different things going on in those. Now, as I mentioned, this process, not the process, but the gathering of hay that was harvested in maybe August or September, went on through the colder months. And you would keep bringing it in. And this is this story, I'm not going to read it, but of that young man at the time who had to go out in these super cold days and bring back salt hay. There's also this quote from Mrs. Coatsworth, right? So I will read that. In the winter months, when deep pile the snowdrifts and the cattle stand in the dusk all day, many a cow shall taste pale seaweed twined in the stalks of the mild salt hay. And a lot of people at the time people growing up in the 20th century were nostalgic, because when they would taste milk from the grocery store, it didn't taste like home. It didn't taste like their childhood, because it didn't taste like the sea, basically. Salty, a little bit marshy. So feeding these cows this stuff gave their milk a very distinct taste that our ancestors, if you were here in Connecticut, at that time, were used to. Today, I don't know if people would go for that, but they did that. There's this period too in the late 19th century where salt haying is very much glorified and glamorized. So a gentleman named Martin Johnson Heed, who was very famous, there are several of his paintings in Connecticut and New York and Massachusetts museums that are these huge, beautiful landscapes. He was famous, and other people were famous for creating these. And it really, it reminds me of these landscapes of like Yellowstone and Yosemite that were coming out at the same period that are just beautiful and make you want to go there, right? These are the same things, but for New England, and it's a beautiful place. Unlike those other landscape paintings, there are people in these. There are New England farmers, and they're stacking up their saute. And people saw these. They saw lots of postcards of the period, especially Lyme. So Lyme is kind of a famous place because there are beautiful marshes there. There was also an art colony there, if you know a little bit about Lyme. So people got these postcards in the mail from people who were visiting coastal towns in Connecticut and Massachusetts. And it was something that you sent home to your relatives because it was a pretty scene. And these are some of the paintings from Florence Griswold's time and her time hosting different artists in Old Lyme and the Lyme area. And a lot of them feature this harvesting of saute in this American impressionist style. So these are just a couple that the Florence Griswold Museum has today that you can see. Of course, saltang declined in the 20th century is when this starts to happen. People are already abandoning farming altogether. The United States getting a lot more modern. And there's a very modern idea that these marshes are pretty useless, that this hay is just a waste of time in gathering it, and we might want to fill in the marshes with lots of soil so they can be used as a real farm. And you can grow carrots and asparagus and broccoli and things like that. So this is basically a little article of an expert of the time, Mr. Hollister, a farming agricultural expert, saying that Great Meadows, which is part of the refuge today, is worthless and it should be filled in for a real farm instead of just a buggy, ugly marsh. So that was kind of the attitude in 1906 and 1910, 1920, that persisted. So saltang declines, farming declines. In the 1920s and 30s, there are projects to create these big channels in the marsh because people are of the notion that these breeding grounds, mosquitoes and things, should be drained of their water to prevent disease. So almost every marsh in Connecticut has ditches in it from the 1920s and 30s that have still not disappeared. They're kind of scars on the landscape. At least that's how we view it now. Back then, they thought that they were doing a good deed and spending government funds wisely. But basically, they used machinery. They employed the unemployed during the Great Depression to take these big chunks out of the marsh and create a channel to drain it of standing water. This is from Deep. Roger Wolf is basically the state biologist in charge of marsh restoration, so he has a lot of these photos. I think this might have been Madison or Westbrook, I'm not sure where it is, but it's the same sort of scene all across the state, all across the Northeast at that time. So a lot of this sees marsh degradation. Is salt marsh haying still done? We know in Connecticut, commercially, it is not done anymore. There are different reasons for that. It's not a super profitable thing. People aren't demanding marsh hay. Another reason, of course, is because in the 1970s, as I mentioned, both federal and state laws are passed to protect marshes for the first time. There were never any laws to protect marshes, to protect the wildlife that lives in them. before that time 50 years ago. So that's really what does away with a lot of marsh hang. But there are still a few operations around Plum Island in Massachusetts that do salt hang. So you can buy it from there. A lot of gardeners prize salt hay to keep the weeds down as a little fertilizer. There aren't any weed seeds in it. So you can still buy it from a couple of commercial farms in that area. That's where that beautiful landscape painting was done that I showed you a couple of minutes ago. There's a National Wildlife Refuge up there called Parker River. And a lot of the marshes are preserved either as refuge or state land or by the farmers who still utilize them. So you can get salt hay, it's just not on a large scale like it used to be, but it's still done a little bit. And they do advertise online, and you can order from their websites. Are there lasting impacts in the marshes, not from the ditching and stuff, but from the farmers? And the answer to that is yes. So this is our marsh in Westbrook. There's an intern in the blue there, and the woman talking to her is the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service salt marsh ecologist for this whole area. She works mainly up in Maine, but she works at all the refuges from Maine down to Virginia and has projects there. And she's basically pointing out, you can barely see it, but you can see the remnants of in this picture here, this picture here, these channels that were hand dug by a farmer 100 or more years ago for the purposes of manipulating that water. Does that degrade the marsh? A little bit. Hand digging certainly degrades it a lot less than mechanical ditching. So that's a good thing. But our focus today in the Fish and Wildlife Service and at the state level with DEEP is to try to repair this if there's money available to do so. So these marshes are a bit more resilient and natural rather than being manipulated. So I do want to talk a little bit about the big restoration that we did at Great Meadows in the last about 5 years we've done it. So it started off because there was money available from a settlement there was a company called Raymark Industries in the town of Stratford. I believe they made Raybestos brakes and things like that. And there was a lot of contamination that was disposed of. So the government sued them and had a settlement. And the way that works is if a company settles and gives money to this fund, it goes back to that community for the restoration. So they degraded the environment, and we try to use that money to restore the environment. So the folks at NOAA, which was the federal entity in charge of that money, decided they wanted to spend the money on the Great Meadows Marsh, which is part of the National Wildlife Refuge where I work. So the study started about 2000, 2001, where we had hydrologists come out. That's one of the Fish and Wildlife Service hydrologists with equipment measuring things. And then he's in the water, obviously. They're on the upper part of the marsh in Stratford there. They also used LiDAR, they used drones flying overhead to look at the elevation and how it was too low in places, too high in places, and came up with a plan to try to adjust that and make it the way it should naturally be. I'll explain why it wasn't the way it naturally should be, because this marsh was manipulated a lot more than most. Some of the first steps in that process, other than determining what they were going to do, was to remove a lot of the vegetation that existed in areas that were way too high, that were artificial. So a Fish and Wildlife Service, Park Service fire team came down and burned the marsh, which was kind of a cool process to see. Mostly they burned Phragmites and other stuff that didn't really belong there in the first place. Some native stuff, but all of this was going to be removed, the soil there. So the idea was to remove a lot of the vegetation so it didn't have to be hauled away. Not as much anyway, and therefore reduce the cost of everything. When the excavation work actually started, we knew we were going to find this. We were not surprised because we knew the history of this marsh. But what had happened at Great Meadows throughout the 20th century is that people basically moved from the idea that we should fill in these marshes and make a cabbage patch to we should fill in the marshes and make a place for a factory. So that's what was done in the 1940s and 50s. And they filled in the marsh with big pieces of concrete, thousands of tires, engine parts from the Army engine plant nearby, and pretty much everything that you could possibly imagine that was junk that they could throw into it. So for those of us around now, those actions of the 1940s seem really strange, but they were pretty normal at that time. So once they started digging to reduce the elevation of these false high upland areas, they found all this stuff and had to haul all of it away. So there were basically tons and tons of piles of this stuff taken away. The excavators moved through, leveled areas out, and of course the next step was, once it was the right elevation, to plant things there. And you can see some volunteers. Now we worked with a lot of different folks, folks from DEP, from the Audubon, both Audubons, but particularly National Audubon. The Beardsley Zoo, lots of other volunteers. They planted tens of thousands of plugs of salt hay, in addition to other plants like marsh pink. That can't be planted in plugs. It was planted with seeds that were gathered from populations there. And also we worked with a company that specializes in that kind of stuff. So this took a couple of seasons just to replant everything, to try to remove any invasives that remained there. And it has done very well. This is what the marsh looked like after, I think, one growing season. So this is the second growing season. This was a few years ago at this point, and it's all filled in now. But you can see some new channels. And these are all the plugs that were planted. This whole area is basically, it was big bumps where those concrete chunks and tires and things were. Now it's all leveled out to become nice high marsh. So the farmers of 150 years ago would have loved to see it now. And we've got things there like plovers. Those are not piping plovers, but they're pretty cool shorebirds that stop there. Mostly though, we focused on helping at-risk species. So things like terrapins, which are at risk in Connecticut, and things like salt marsh sparrow. This is a unique species that nests right on the marsh. They don't pick a tree near the marsh. They nest in the high marsh, and just, I guess they hope and pray that the tide doesn't wash out their nest. Now, of course, sometimes it does. What we did also, and I don't have a photo of this, but there's a really nice story map online that you can find if you just Google Great Meadows story map. They created something that they called hummocks. which isn't usually a term that's used here, but it's basically a bump specifically placed out in the middle of the high marsh that they're hoping that salt marsh sparrows will utilize because the chances of their nest being washed out on those hummocks is far less. And there's a study going on with UConn and others, so many people involved in this, to see if the sparrows will be using that. We know that they're nesting there already. We know that they're successful. I don't know the percentage, a decent amount of time in having babies. So we're hoping that that increases with this restoration effort. But there were lots of different things. So helping these birds, other birds, crabs, turtles, and also reducing mosquitoes. So there were parts of this marsh that caught standing water, which are gone now. And the hope is, so if you went there about 6 years ago in the middle of the summer, you couldn't take a nice walk because there were just too many mosquitoes. The hope is that those mosquitoes have mostly disappeared from there now because there are no suitable, or a lot less suitable breeding areas for them. So public health will also be improved at the end of this project. And also you can take a walk, and I've been there now in the past July, I think I was there, and the mosquitoes weren't that bad. So lots of different things were done during this process. It took a long time, and it's still actually ongoing with us employing young people there every summer to do a little bit more planting, more invasives removal, education of the visitors who come there, and things like that. So it's a very good success story, and we're hoping that it just gets better and better. And this marsh was chosen because of how degraded it was. And now it has made a big turnaround, which is nice to see. It's nice to be part of a big project like this, even though I was a very small part in it. I just made sure that there were good places for people to view the marsh. The biologists did all the hard work with this. So that is the end of this presentation. I would be happy to answer any questions that you have, if I can, about marshes in general, about restoration, or about our main topic, which is salt marsh haymakers. Yeah.
Is the salt hay more salinic? Does it have more salt? How do the animals adapt to that? And will they change to absorb that if we actually start farming it again?
That's a good question. And I'm not sure I can answer that other than to say it definitely is more saline. It's very salty. Animals are not used to it today, so I don't know if they would adapt to it. But that's all that a lot of these cows and other farm animals were being fed at the time. So basically, if you were a farmer in that time period, the 1700s, 1800s, your animals were just going to eat that. And they didn't have much of a choice in a lot of cases. But they tolerated it, the saltiness of it. So that's all I can say about it, really. I wish I knew more. If you could switch a cow to it now, I doubt it. I think they'd be a little pickier to do that. But other questions? Yeah.
Yeah, I grew up right next to the great salt metal orchard.
Okay.
And I know Bridgeport's trying to get rid of the towards the airport. Is the federal government thought about buying the airport and letting it go back to Marsh?
Yeah, that's also a good question. So, I'm not an expert on it, so this could be slightly inaccurate. But from what I understand is the federal government through the FAA had already purchased a lot of that area and given it to the city of Bridgeport to make into an airport. And there's no way that having already paid for it once, that the federal government would buy it again. So it's a very strange situation. They would have to probably donate it, pieces of it, which probably could be done, but I'm not the expert at that. There are realty people who, in the agency who could probably tell you more, but that's the story that I heard as to why that hasn't happened. But it's a good question that people have wondered about. Yeah. Yes?
Would one consequence of not harvesting, or of harvesting rather, the salt hay mean that a mat of decaying hay would not form, and therefore the resilience of the marsh would be affected?
That's a good question, actually. I don't know the story of that. Typically what happens is, so the grasses will decay and if they're not harvested, very gradually build up that high marsh over time. And that's the natural process, and the process that we kind of want to happen. Keep building it up. If it's harvested, which is not allowed in a lot of cases because of today we protect all of these species. If it's harvested, that wouldn't happen, and it may stay at the same level or actually subside. I'm not an expert at that, but that's what I think is the case. Yeah.
Is there truth to the transporting the salt hay to Middletown and Hartford via horse on the Connecticut River?
So, yeah, I'm sure it was transported probably in every way that you could imagine, probably mostly by boat on the river, possibly by horse and even railroad later on. I don't know any specific stories, but I know that it was basically a commodity at that time that was sold everywhere. If it was a big enough operation. If it was a small operation, the farmer might just use that for his own purposes. But yeah, it was often transported for sale. Other questions? Yeah, we'll go here first.
About how much was it? I mean, we all know the jail costs and where to go and,
Right.
what was the marching like?
I don't know. I don't know how much it costs. I actually should look up from the websites that I showed you how much it costs today.
Or the quantity and the packing of it? I mean, what did it look like when it was sold to?
Yeah,
It's ginormous.
I have no idea, actually. I didn't come across any records of that, photos of what it looked like or whatever. It would depend probably on where you were, what time it was, 20th century was different than previously.
How far away from shore you were, the lady mentioned.
Right,
Hartford,
definitely,
not
yeah.
down here.
Yeah. So good question, but I don't know, I'm sorry. Yeah, back there.
Is the soil in the marshes, is it anything like peat?
It is, it's very much like that, yeah. If you, let me see if I can get back to the picture here. So if you see that core, this core, it's very much like peat. Now, to my knowledge, it was never used like peat where people burned it, like they do sometimes in Ireland and other places. But yeah, I mean, you could take that core out probably and use it that way. It's very similar. Basically, there's no soil there. It's all just decayed grasses from previous seasons. Very squishy. You could dry it out and use it for purposes. I don't think people did that much, but it was possible to do. Yeah, we'll go there.
I used to buy salt hay at Van Wilgen's back in the
Oh, you did?
early to mid-90s.
Okay,
And it was about 3 times more expensive than regular hay.
right,
And it
okay.
was the size of a bale.
So it was a regular bale, but 3 times as much. Okay, that's
where was
great,
that?
great.
Van Wilgen's.
Really? Our
And
Van
the sellers here.
Yeah,
No.
down the road.
They still sell that? Yeah.
Well, no, they're in house, and they used to sell salt.
Okay, gotcha.
I wonder if it smelled different.
No, there's a
Yeah, Deanna says no. Yeah, I don't know. Maybe if it was fresh or something, it might.
We
smell.
used to cut it down right around here in Guilford.
Did you?
Yeah, we used to get our tractors out on the marshes, and it was, talking about how dirty those guys were.
Yeah,
You had this dark dirt all in your
Right.
nostrils and all over the place. It had its own smell for sure.
yeah.
I mean, it was a
okay.
mud smell, you know?
Right, yes, yeah. Yeah,
How far down does the, if you're sinking into it, walking the rock,
yeah.
to go down?
Yeah, it depends on what part of the marsh you're in. So, yeah, I mean, so I don't know how deep we could dig in here. You know, how much that layer goes, I really couldn't tell you, but it depends on a lot of factors. The inundation of the tide and how close you are to the forest, the edge of the marsh, stuff like that. Yeah.
What are the plans for the rising sea level for climate change?
Yeah, so to my knowledge, it certainly hasn't happened on our refuge. I don't know if it's happened in areas of Connecticut, but I know that it has happened in parts of New England. There's a process called thin layer deposition, where basically it's costly, but you can get a specialist to come with equipment and broadcast materials onto the marsh to basically speed up the natural process to raise the elevation of the marsh. So it's very expensive, hasn't been done on our refuge, but that is one way that people have tried to tackle rising waters, basically. So it's thin layer deposition, it's broad, kind of like if you're out with a seed spreader or what, on a much larger scale, they're broadcasting this natural material so it builds up and the grasses basically seed on top of that. It's not easy to do that. That's one thing. I'm sure that the hydrologist that I showed you has other ideas for that. It's not really being done on a large scale. Another thing that we're certainly thinking about is there anything behind the marsh, right? So the marsh will migrate naturally. So what is a marsh edge with sort of upland plants that are salt tolerant will become not an edge anymore and will be absorbed into the marsh. That can only happen if there's nothing else there. As I mentioned, most of Connecticut, there are houses there, there are people's lawns there, and they're going to, mow their lawn as far down to the view, basically. So that can only be done in natural areas like the refuge or a state park or, whatever, protected area. It may or may not keep up with what's going to happen. But that's a good question. People are thinking about it. It's just that there's a lot of money involved in stuff that they may be able to do. Any other questions? Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.